Let's debate the road ahead. Joining me from Phoenix, Arizona, is the former U.S. Comptroller General David Walker. That means he kept the government's books. And with me here in Washington is Robert Kuttner, co-editor of the American Prospect magazine. Mr. Walker, to you first. You have been screaming for some time about what you consider to be the fiscal insanity in Washington. I have the outline of the leadership draft here. When you look at this proposal, it's a serious document. It doesn't eliminate the deficit. But is this the place to start the debate, or did these guys get it wrong?
It is just a beginning. It's a courageous and a comprehensive proposal where everything is on the table: budget controls, social insurance reforms, defense and other spending cuts, tax reform and tax increases. I commend the president for saying that people shouldn't shoot prematurely. I think it is irresponsible for leaders on either side of the political aisle to be condemning anything at this point. They don't have a plan. If we don't have a plan, we don't have a prayer to solve the problem.
And yet, Bob Kuttner, you are one of the leaders in the liberal movement of America who says no way. Why?
Well, first of all, just because a plan is unpopular and just because it inflicts a lot of pain doesn't make it a good idea. And the question I raise is, what is this plan a solution to? We're in a very severe, prolonged recession, the most serious recession since the Great Depression. Most standard economics would say you don't cure a recession by more austerity. You don't take a situation where people have 15 million Americans out of work, 9 or 10% unemployment, and that's what's predicted, by the way, for a year from now when this starts to bite, and tighten belts even more, which is just going to throw more people out of work. This is about sequencing. I'm all in favor of bringing the budget closer to balance. But let's get a recovery going first. Well,
part of the question, though, is we live in a democracy, and the American people just took the House of Representatives away from the Democrats and gave it to the Republicans, in part because they're concerned about all the spending in Washington. You make a point, but the liberal reaction was, it touches Social Security, forget about it. Unacceptable, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said. If we have divided government, which is what we will have in January, Democratic president, a Republican House, and a narrowly Democratic Senate, if people just decide, forget about it, and won't even start the conversation, saying, okay, it's too much cuts here, or it's the tax increases are too big. Why can't we at least come to the table and discuss it before we say forget about it?
Well, we can. This is about sequencing. You don't inflict austerity when you're still in the middle of a very dire recession. I'm all in favor, and I think most liberals are in favor, of bringing the budget closer to balance. But people voted the Democrats out of the House of Representatives because of the depth of the recession and the depth of joblessness, not because of a idealized conception that, oh, the budget ought to be balanced. People are hurting. People are out of work. That's why the Democrats lost 60-some seats.
Go ahead, Mr. Walker.
John, quite frankly, with all due respect to Speaker Pelosi, her comments were irresponsible. Secondly, I agree with Bob that we need to separate the short-term from the structural. But by the way, most of the proposals in this mark didn't end up calling for tax increases or cuts right away. They delayed them. We need to do what it takes to make sure that we end up having a recovery. We need to make sure we get unemployment down. We need to have a plan that we can phase in that will end up not undercutting this economic recovery, while at the same point in time showing our foreign lenders that we're serious about putting our federal financial house in order.
You're shaking your head.
This phase is in much too quickly. This phase is in less than a year from now, when most economic projections say unemployment is still going to be 9 or 10%, and everything is not on the table.
So would you say then that they should have a serious conversation about this, and the left should go in saying, look, we need to push the effective date back a little bit, but we will talk about Social Security and Medicare, as long as the Republicans will talk about some revenue increases?
Well, let's separate out Social Security. Social Security is going to be in surplus for the next 27 years. Social Security has nothing to do with the budget deficit.
Well, they don't use their changes. They don't use their changes.
That is false. That is false. Social Security is running a cash flow deficit. It is adding to the deficit. It will be in a permanent cash flow deficit starting in 2015. That is just false.
I'm sorry.
Look, I'm a trustee. I know what the numbers are, okay? That's just false.
Look, this commission was charged with, David, the report says that Social Security has nothing to do with the current deficit, and the cuts are not going to take effect for decades. I don't know why Social Security is part of this at all, except for ideological opposition to the whole idea.
Because it's a chance to see the expectation of every generation of Americans. What was proposed here was very moderate, and by the way, you know, the fact of the matter is I agree that we need to look at when these cuts should take place. I would respectfully suggest we ought to look at once we're sure we're not going to have a double-dip recession and once unemployment gets down to a reasonable level. So I agree with you on that, Bob, but we have to have everything on the table.
Well, everything
we have to face things.
Everything is not on the table. The Bush tax cuts cost $4 trillion over a decade. They're not on the table. Before the Bush tax cuts, the budget was balanced.
They should be.
Well, thank you.
All right,
we can agree on that.
Well, let's end on a point of agreement. We'll continue this conversation for the next weeks and months, and unfortunately,